My name is Carl Olson, and I almost said I was the director of the library. But I am not.
Promoting yourself, are
And
you?
I don't even know where that came from.
Ambition.
But I do work here at Missoula Public Library, and I welcome you to Out at the Library. We're kicking off kind of week 3, I think, of our programming, which is happening in conjunction with the exhibit. And I hope most of you have had a chance to study our exhibit down here in the library. We're very excited about it. I have just a few announcements to make. We do appreciate evaluations of every program that you come to here. All of our programs are free to patrons and people in the community, but your evaluation helps us continue to provide great programming in the future. So please fill one out at the end of the evening or before. We have some event sponsors I would like to thank. Our major sponsors are the Human Rights Network, Montana Humanities, David C. Moomey and the High Stakes Foundation. We also have some library sponsors, and those include the Library Foundation, the Friends of the Library, and the Library Adult Programming Committee. And there are many other folks that have given in-kind gifts and smaller gifts that have made this possible. The Western Montana Gay and Lesbian Community Center has been very generous, both with supporting the events and giving us space in the Outwards newsletter to get the word out in the community. We just got more space in the next newsletter, so that's wonderful. I want to introduce to you someone who will be here for the next 3 days doing programs. Will Roscoe arrived today from San Francisco, and he's there and right under a spotlight. You'll learn a lot more about him over the next couple of days, but he is doing a program Saturday evening called The Changing Ones, and it's about the third gender tradition and what we commonly call Two-Spirit folks, their history in the Native American world. And then he'll be doing a reading and discussion at Fact and Fiction Sunday afternoon. We do have calendars in the back if you'd like to learn more about those and need the exact times and locations for those events. So I'm going to introduce quickly our panelists here, and we'll get going with tonight's program, which is called Why the Gays and Lesbians and Bisexual Folks and Transgender People too, anyone queer, how they saved civilization. And tonight's panel, we have Brian Cochran, who's to my right. He's an assistant professor of psychology at the university, and his main research topic is on LGBT issues. Raphael Chacon is to my left. He's a professor of art history and criticism, and he's an architectural historian. He has a book coming out about Glacier Park's art, right?
About A.J. Gibson.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know. I hope you have a book coming out about Glacier Park.
Me too.
John Eglin is a professor of history, and he's going to talk about our sodomite heritage tonight. John is at that end. Anya Jabor is a professor of history, and she's co-director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the university, and she's at this end. And Kay's between John and Raphael. She's a longtime activist, organizer, writer, and a sly, irreverent cultural observer. That's what we'll do in the way of introductions tonight. And I'll let each of these folks get right into their topics. And we'll start with you, Brian.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to thank you all for being here. It's really nice to have this event being put on by the library and by the various sponsors. And thank you, Carl, for moderating the discussion. So I decided I'd actually try to do something novel with this panel and actually try to answer the question that it asks. So how the gays saved civilization. I think it's a very interesting question for a variety of different reasons. And I came up with a few ideas that I'll just sort of use as a launching pad for our discussion that we'll have shortly. So my background is as a psychologist, and I think about things from the perspective of clinical psychology and mental health issues. So some of the examples I'll talk about are from that perspective. One of the key issues that LGBT people face when often seeking services from a mental health practitioner is issues related to coming out. So I guess that's the first answer that I have as about how the gays save civilization. It's by coming out, which is a very, of course, personalized and individualized experience that depends on whether or not people are safe or have the environmental circumstances to do so. But I have a brief story that I wanted to talk a little bit about, which gives you an example of how someone's coming out changed the course of history a little bit. This has to do with a famous psychologist named Evelyn Hooker. You may have heard of her. She is one of the first people who did research in terms of gay and lesbian mental health. She was focusing on gay men specifically. And she did a study basically looking at 30 gay men and 30 heterosexual men and had them to take a variety of psychological tests. Of course, at this time, most of the mental health establishment thought that being gay, bisexual, transgender, was a pathology. And she had the revolutionary idea that this was not necessarily the case. So she set about to prove it by having people to evaluate these different psychological profiles and found, sure enough, that a panel of experts could not tell the difference between the gay men in the panel and the heterosexual men. So I'm telling this story not because Evelyn Hooker was a famous lesbian, because she wasn't. She was a heterosexual woman. But she was influenced to do the study by a friend of hers, a footnote of gay and lesbian history named Sam. And Sam had become friends with Evelyn Hooker, and through the process of that, she started to realize that maybe not all gay people had problems. And he said, well, it's incumbent upon you, now that you have this knowledge, to do a study and to set out and prove that's the case. So that was really the impetus for her doing the study. So gay and lesbian people changed civilization by coming out. A second way that the gays have saved civilization is by unifying with other people who have shared experiences of oppression. So obviously we've broadened from the initial title of this being how the gays save civilization to LGBTQI, all the different aspects of the acronym there. And I think that by unifying with people who have other shared experiences of oppression, we're a lot stronger and our voice is heard much more readily. Any student who has had any knowledge of gay and lesbian history whatsoever knows that the Stonewall riots were as much about transgender activism as they were about gay, lesbian, bisexual activism. And I think through uniting in these different ways, we've been able to show our strength as LGBTQI people. That's what I'm going to end with so far, and we'll pick up from there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anya?
Okay. That's not alphabetical.
I'm shaking it up.
So as Carl mentioned, I'm affiliated with both the History Department and the Women's and Gender Studies program at the university. The source of that dual affiliation is my area of specialty, which is U.S. women's history. And so from the perspective of a U.S. women's historian, I have sort of modified the title, How Gays Saved Civilization, to How Lesbians Saved America. Possibly from itself. And the basic point I want to make here is that lesbians have a long and distinguished heritage of activism in the United States. But because time is short, I'm just going to give 3 particular examples. And if you want to know more about any of these folks or anyone else who sort of were part of this long tradition, I really recommend a great book by Lillian Faderman called To Believe in Women. And the subtitle is What Lesbians Have Done for America, a History, which pretty much tells you the argument of the book, and you can see why it fits in with the panel on how gays save civilization. Okay, but to be brief, lesbians saved America by making it more humane, by making it more democratic, and by making it more secure for all of its inhabitants. And particular, lesbians are associated with each of these efforts to make America better. With respect to making America a more humane place to live, lesbians were responsible in the 1880s for pioneering the field of social work. And probably the most widely recognized lesbian reformer in this tradition is Jane Addams, who was, of course, the founder of the settlement house, Hull House, in Chicago in 1889. She founded it with her college girlfriend. They drifted apart within a year after the founding, but Jane Addams then spent the rest of her life with her lifelong partner, Mary Rose Smith. So Jane Addams, with the help of actually two different partners, helped to make America more humane. Lesbians also helped make America more democratic. How? Well, by making sure that the female citizens had the right to vote. There were several women and many lesbians affiliated with this movement, but the one I want to mention is Alice Paul, largely because Alice Paul's role in bringing suffrage to sort of ahead and finally achieving the right to vote through hunger striking has been popularized in the HBO movie Iron-Jawed Angels, which portrays both Alice Paul and her partner Lucy Burns as pining away for the love of men throughout the entire movie, which is really bizarre in that they were lovers. Anyway, so all right, so there, Alice Paul and her partner Lucy Burns are a good example of lesbians making America more democratic. And finally, lesbians also made America more secure, by which I mean they provided for Social Security and other aspects of the welfare state in the 1930s. And probably nobody here has heard of the person associated with this. It's not Eleanor Roosevelt, which is what you might be thinking, but it's Molly Dewson. And Molly Dewson, her middle initial was W, and she was sometimes known as More Women Dewson, because she was responsible for bringing so many women into the New Deal administration during the 1930s, and she was, with those women, one of the architects of the welfare state, of the Social Security Act of 1935, which established Social Security, minimum wage laws, maximum hour laws, now defunct AFDC, etc. Okay, so those are just three people on the sort of early end of the tradition, but I think that gives you a sense of how lesbians saved America.
Raphael?
I'm going to talk about three artists. This is nice that we're listening to this kind of array of individuals, all responsible for somehow saving civilization. And I think of the artists as central to the development, the creation of civilization. So it's not necessarily saving it. But the big question about the three artists I'm going to discuss, three Renaissance artists, is not so much whether they indeed created Western civilization or Western culture as we know it. We know they did that. I mean, they were, of course, Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo. But the question is, of course, were they actually homosexuals? So, and that's really the question that we've been asking for the last 150 years or so, and arguably a lot longer than that. So, before these three great Renaissance artists were Renaissance artists, before they were Ninja Turtles, they were Renaissance artists and therefore saviors of mankind. So, and at least since the late 19th century, there have been great speculations as to whether indeed these people had a peculiar or different sexuality, and if that sexuality did in fact impact the nature of their work, their artistry, what they contributed to the development of our society. So let's start with Donatello. The only real evidence we have that Donatello was gay was the fact that he lived alone his entire life. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a qualifier being a homosexual, and yet he never showed any interest in the opposite sex. So it is entirely plausible that he was gay. But the damning evidence, of course, is in the proof is in the pudding, and the pudding in his case was his first major monumental sculpture, which was a statue of a bronze statue of David. It's the first life-size bronze statue in the Italian Renaissance. And this David wasn't the virile king of the Israelites in the Old Testament. He was a pubescent, nude boy wearing a floppy hat with flowers, couldn't even lift the sword that he had just used to behead Goliath. And if that isn't evidence of Donatello's proclivities, I don't know what is. But there's an even more interesting detail. He is shown with his foot on the head of the defeated Goliath, and that defeated Goliath was known to have been a portrait of the elder Donatello. And on the helmet of this defeated Goliath is an image of these putti, these cavorting cupids, dancing on his head. And so the historians have interpreted this as an argument for this greater theme, this Renaissance theme that love conquers war. You know, the embodiment of love, this beautiful David, has in fact defeated the giant, the warrior. But isn't Donatello really saying that he's been smoten down by a beautiful boy? And that's possibly what the argument is there. So Donatello as a potential homosexual, possible homosexual, plausible homosexual, probable homosexual, and a great contributor to Western culture. Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo was so eccentric that his possible homosexuality is lumped in with all kinds of eccentricities. For example, we know that he slept on straw, that he was a vegetarian, and that was enough to disqualify this guy as queer, or qualify him as queer. But we know since 1896, when the archives of the city of Florence were published, that a lawsuit was brought against Leonardo and two other young men for having illicit relationships. In other words, the crime was sodomy, and I guess we're going to hear more from sodomy from that end of the table. But he was supposedly he was denounced for committing sodomy with a Jacopo Saltarelli who was 17 years old, and it was really a denouncement. He was eventually acquitted from this, but he never offered any proof that he hadn't actually committed sodomy with this young man, this boy of bad repute, as he was called. And then, of course, he went on for the next 18 years to live with a very beautiful young man by the name of Salai, who he indulged with all kinds of goods and luxuries and affection, apparently. Salai, Andrea Salaino, as he was known, was nicknamed Salai, which was short for Salaino, which means little devil. So Leonardo da Vinci spent 18 years living with a little devil, a beautiful boy. That's not to say that he was a libertine or actually indulged himself in living at the edge of society. In fact, he was, if anything, Leonardo was a moralist. And so just to kind of round out this conversation about him, he said that the act of copulation and the members employed in it are so ugly that if it were not for the beauty of the faces and the attributes of those taking part, and the presentation of the human preservation of the human species would no longer be preserved. Michelangelo. Now, this is a guy who obviously wrestled with all kinds of issues in his own life, but among them were, of course, guilt, shame, fear about his spiritual salvation, and yet simultaneously he indulged himself almost exclusively in depictions of the male body as the central figure of his art. He is indeed the central figure of the Italian Renaissance. And there's no evidence that he had any sexual interest at all in women, and there are very few actual images of women in his works that can be said to express any kind of interest on his part in women. In fact, his females are viragos. That is, as one of my classmates in graduate school said, these are women with boobs. Or, excuse me, these are men with boobs. With the punchline. And the overwhelming evidence that tells us that Michelangelo was homosexual, if we want to use that modern title on an individual who lived his life mostly in the 16th century, is the fact that he had an extended relationship in letters and in gifts, and the exchange of gifts with a young man by the name of Tommaso Cavalieri. And those letters really are so touching and so personal and so out of the norm for Michelangelo that that's really the strongest evidence where his true love, where his true heart lay. And so I just want to end by reading a line, a quotation from one of those letters to Tommaso Cavalieri from the 1520s. He says, "What I desire, what I learned from the beauty of your face, cannot be understood by ordinary men. He who wishes to understand it must first die." So,
Thank you, Raphael. Kay, are you ready?
I think I should go last.
Okay.
For a very particular reason.
Okay. John, tell us about sodomy.
Well, I mean, we're going to have some about Sodom rather than sodomy, really. But well, I am an academically trained historian, but I'm going to present this very much in the mode of the History Channel, and many of you may have seen the History Channel, which people who are advertised as historians then go on to talk basically about whatever they want. So the whatever I want here is not necessarily the subject I was academically trained in. But as an historian, one thing I've noticed over the years, in the 20-odd years that I've been doing this one way or another, is that usually our approach to, let me make sure I've got all the letters here, LGBTIQ, are there any new ones I haven't heard about?
It's a second Q.
Because I don't really, there's a second Q, okay, well,
Queer in question.
a GQ, well, that's a problem.
Let's have a
Yeah,
panel discussion.
whatever, is to go looking for hidden heroes and heroines of our lost history. And for example, I teach a European Civ course, and I was once reproached in an email from a student for teaching, getting through the Middle Ages and never once mentioning that Richard the Lionhearted, the great crusader, was gay. As everyone knows, from having seen Katharine Hepburn in The Lion in Winter. It's beautiful. And more recently, of course, I mean, there are exceptions to this. Raphael has pointed out the problem. We have no real evidence. I mean, it's very rare that we have the case of someone like Abraham Lincoln, whose sexuality now seems, whose homosexuality now seems so beyond question that we are beyond Lincoln straight or gay to Lincoln top or bottom. And I suggest that perhaps for a future library event we can have impersonators, a debate between Butch Lincoln and Camp Lincoln, moderated, of course, if we can get Harry Fritz out of retirement, especially if he agrees to dress up as Mary Todd. But I had planned to begin my remarks much more portentously, and you must bear as I get into Episcopal Church lector mode. From the first book of Moses, called Genesis, here beginneth the 19th chapter. So here's the story. There were two angels who came from God to check out Sodom. Once they entered the town, they were surrounded by a bunch of men who wanted to gang rape them. This guy named Lot offered his two daughters to the sexually ravenous crowd so they would not rape the angels, and while they dickered over the two daughters, the angels struck the people blind, and the holy men and Lot's family made their escape from Sodom. Once outside Sodom, the angels brought God's wrath down on it, meaning Sodom. And Lot's wife looked back on her town and, in consequence, was turned into a phallic pillar of salt. And this, of course, is not from the Bible, but from a marvelous collection of scholarly and critical essays together with primary texts called Reclaiming Sodom, edited by Jonathan Goldberg, and this is the title essay, which is only about 2 pages long, and by a fellow named Rocky O'Donovan, and I recommend that and the other essays in here to you, although I don't necessarily agree with a lot of it, is because we get into the conventional rant against organized Western religion, Christianity in particular, which I find very tedious, frankly. But there we are. So, turning to the Sodom story, which is, where it really all begins for us, isn't it? Progressive biblical scholars, when they approach Genesis 19, the story which did not end up for some reason in our Bible stories for children, which we all remember fondly from the dentist's office, they usually try to claim that Genesis 19 really isn't about homosexuality at all. John Boswell, the famous medieval historian, even went so far as to claim that the Hebrew word know, which is very important, bring the men out that we may know them, is not, in this case, shorthand for intercourse, but is meant to be more literally in the sense of identify. I find this dodge, although I still think it's a dodge, and not convincing, much more convincing than the tortured hospitality argument that somehow the men of Sodom were inhospitable by sexually assaulting these people. And, when I have inhospitable thoughts like the teenagers from next door sitting on my lawn, sexual assault is not what occurs to me. What occurs to me is get the hell off my lawn and sit on your own. Parenthetically, there is a strikingly similar episode in the book of Judges. It's very easy to remember, but it is also the 19th chapter of the book of Judges, where you have a very similar episode with a very different and much more grisly outcome, which raises all kinds of interpretive questions about what the men of Sodom intend and what this story in Genesis 19 is really supposed to mean. I would like to contend, in the way that Rocky O'Donovan does, that rather the story is about homosexuality, that it is about us, and that we should really we should reclaim it, because it's about us and so much more. It's about what happens at the interface, in this case, of a nomadic tribal society and an emerging urban culture. And it's about the basic tension, which I think is part of the tissue, the fabric of civilization. Human civilization begins in the city. After all, that is the root, literally, of the word civilization. And the city, for nomadic pastoralists, or, to use a contemporary analog, good, plain, God-fearing, red state country folk, in the received narrative, the city is where bad things happen. The city is where you get ripped off, and it is an inhospitable place, not necessarily meaning that every stranger you meet wants to sexually assault you. Far from it, that's often the problem. And the city, historically, as inhospitable as it is to some people, is hospitable to the marginalized and the outcast. And gays have flocked there, as have generations of immigrants did before and still do. So I would contend that we haven't merely saved civilization. In a very real sense, we are civilization. And I'm going to give Rocky O'Donovan the last word. He says, "I like Sodom now. I feel comfortable there. And now Sodom is ours. So let's take back Sodom. Let's rebuild there. They always give us wastelands, and we always turn them into music and gardens full of our passions, desires, beauties. In that space, I can stand my ground.
Thank you.
Wow.
Wow.
See, I knew I should come last. When I grew up in Pueblo, Colorado, there were a lot of parades. You know, there was usually the state fair parade, but in all the parades, there were horses. You know, so the very last person in the parade came along with a push brooms. Except in this case, I knew the minute we started with Evelyn Hooker and Alice Paul, and we go on to Leonardo da Vinci and, you know, Lot's wife and the Bible, I knew I was going to be the total low-rent person. So instead of sweeping up everybody else's shit, I come flinging my own little low-rent piece of dung. But it is my humble offering. And I want to reframe the question from how the gays or the queers saved civilization, to reframe it to ask how queers subverted civilization in useful ways, or even how queers continually try to save ourselves and other people from civilization. And having reframed it, I will be lifting up the works of the truly trashy and heroic contemporary filmmaker John Waters, who I feel has done quite a bit to both subvert civilization and to try to save us all from it, and who exemplifies the idea, as he says, that gays have to use laughter as terrorism within the popular culture of a repressive society to free ourselves. So let me touch briefly on why, and then we'll come right back to John. The first is that, let's face it, civilization is not always such a great bargain from the point of view of those who are on the short end of the stick, like in the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Industrial Revolution, the genocide of Native Americans, and other grand civilizing adventures. And although civilization always refers in one sense to processes of socialization, these aren't just about trying to create civil relationships with one another and letting the arts and thought flourish in a million different ways and creating straightforward conditions for social and economic process. They're all about trying also, these processes of socialization are about getting us to adjust to truly oppressive things. And to accept those, to accept without protest or transgression, deadly dull kinds of conformity. And so far, heteronormativity has been kind of one of the linchpins of Western civilization, and I'm all for tearing it down. And by heteronormativity, I mean that sort of great tangled, clustery clot of different kinds of social and economic and cultural conventions and traditions that mean we have to ascribe to a very rigid, very differentiated set of gender and sexual norms. So I'm always drawn to queers who try to interrupt those processes of socialization that are repressive, and who help us realize that heteronormativity is nothing immutable, it's not nature, it's not unchangeable, that there are all kinds of creative possibilities for sexual and gender fluidity and transgression, even in a repressive society. And that I contend that we always have to keep in mind the idea of what we as queers can do and have done and must do in the future to keep our imaginations and our precious outsider perspective alive and vibrant, so we aren't just stomped into one great big bland ball of assimilated mush. Now, I said John Waters is one of the sort of creative geniuses. He's also called the Prince of Puke, the Sultan of Sleaze. Some of you have seen or heard of his movies, Mondo Trasho, Multiple Maniacs, Pink Flamingos, Female Trouble, Desperate Living, Polyester, the original 1988 Hairspray, Crybaby, A Dirty Shame, Serial Mom, Pecker, Cecil B. Demented. And of course, Hairspray was just turned into a very successful Broadway musical and then became the big family movie hit of 2007. Well, John Waters really is kind of one of the pioneers of community-oriented independent film in this country. And I just want to mention some of the really wonderful characteristics of John Waters' films that make him so wonderful. And if you haven't seen anything other than Hairspray, I really recommend you go sort of delve back into the truly trashy, sleazy past of some of John Waters' other films. Now, he always relentlessly parodies middle-class values and conventions. In his movies, there's always a war going on between the sort of happily lunatic misfits and outcasts and this sort of bitter group of people who represent the dominant culture, who are just terribly threatened by this lunacy and happiness that they do not share and do not understand, and are constantly trying to stamp it out. And the lunatics in John Waters' films always win. They absolutely always win, although they win in terms of John Waters' world. It's not daylight winning, it's twilight winning. He actually loves all of his characters, even the really bitter ones, and invests everybody with a kind of endearing humanity. He never just makes fun of people. They may say and do ridiculous things, but they're always intensely human, and he's always looking at that, the lunatics and the people who are trying to stomp them out. And it's the most wonderful exploration of outsiders being, trying to be assimilated and stomped out into so that they don't even exist. He's always breaking the rules of good taste, sexual and gender conventions, the idea of what constitutes punishment, the idea of what constitutes pleasure. He always pushes boundaries. He always creates a kind of goofy family of sorts, and it's not always a biological family. It's always the real family, except in something like Serial Mom, in which it's sort of both, a biological family and a goofy family. People are creating their families. And there's always an enormous amount of transgressive joy going on. He mixes everything up in terms of sex, gender, race, class, all the time. And he talks about casting with deviant joy, so that in a movie like Cry Baby, you get a cast that includes Johnny Depp, Iggy Pop, Joey Heatherton, Polly Bergen, Troy Donahue, who else? David Nelson from the old Ozzie and Harriet, Tracy Lords and Joe D'Alessandro, two of the greatest porn stars of the late 20th century. So everything's always mixed up. Everything's a constant transgression. He's constantly skewering sexual hypocrisy, and sex in his movies is as ridiculous as anything else. He loves to provoke liberals, especially because he says liberals say they're for everything until it touches their own lives. And so he loves to go directly into the heart. So we can talk, we could think about movies like Serial Mom, in which the perfect middle-class mother who loves her family fiercely kills in the name of social convention and family values. And she becomes a celebrity for it because he's willing to explore all the ways in which our society values the things that are wrong and disvalues the things that may be actually real, like people taking joy in their own lives.
Wow, thank you all. So, I don't even know how to wrap all that up. We went from gays save civilization by basically saving themselves, coming out, as Brian said, to lesbians saved, and in many ways built America. That was Anya's piece. Raphael makes the case that gays created civilization, and John said we are civilization. And then we've got Kay, who says,
Flinging her dong.
who talked about gays subverting civilization and saving ourselves from it. So we kind of went full circle, from the mental health profession to John Waters.
It works.
It works. So is there a common denominator I'm going to ask our panelists, is there a common denominator? Do you detect one that makes queer folk especially amenable to having a unique role on mainstream culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I'll go first. I think it's a sensitivity that people develop by growing up in a society that might be hostile to them. And if you grow up with an awareness that you might be queer, then you're attuned to all sorts of subtle or overt messages that you might be in danger. Of course, that has a self-protective element to it, but then as you go throughout life, I think it makes you sensitive to other aspects of people's suffering too. One of the greatest quotes that I've heard, and I'm not going to quote it exactly, and I can't give you the source, which is terrible as an academic, but it's that gay and lesbian people are one of the few minority groups who grow up without the ability of their parents socializing them into their otherness, with the exception of deaf children who have parents who can hear. So gay and lesbian folks really don't have a way of making sense of their culture that is transmitted to them generation to generation, and to socializing them into their otherness in a way that a lot of people of other minority groups do. And I think we go about society with this increased sensitivity, and we use it in a lot of different creative ways to help the world.
Anyone else want to address
No,
that?
I think it's about being outsiders and sort of misfits within a dominant culture. But not everyone grows up sort of with quite that sense of misfittedness. I mean, some people come later to an understanding, so they kind of get that a little bit later. But there's no way you can exist in this culture right now, no matter where you are, even if you lived in the Castro in San Francisco, without being the outsider.
Feeling the wrath at some point.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I've always had this question in my mind. What would happen if, in fact, gay people were normative? I mean, if homosexuality were, in fact, and I think there's obviously this, the question that John Waters poses is this agenda an attempt to normalize the eccentricities of our lives? Or is it an intent to sort of celebrate them and say, we enjoy this and we're not going to change regardless of what the dominant culture does? And I guess my question is, if indeed we were accepted, fully accepted legally, economically, whatever, socially, whatever measure we used, would we stop being unique? Would we stop being creative? Would we lose the cause of, that has made us, change society for the better, or seek out the, the disenfranchised and help other minority groups? I mean, it's a big question.
Well,
That's a point that Michael Warner makes in his book called, I think, The Trouble with Normal. And of course, what's happening is that we are becoming quote unquote normal. We are assimilating. We're moving to the suburbs where we're having children. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course. We're buying barbecue grills and having the neighbors over for barbecues, and becoming quite boring and middle class. And for my own thinking is sort of, there's a part of me that really enjoys conforming and being repressed and all of that, because I grew up in the South and I was raised a white Protestant, and it's sort of part of who I am. But I'm struck by that, and I'm also struck by the way that gays, in common with other sort of out groups in the United States specifically, and I suppose gays in sort of Western culture more generally, are often the shapers of the civilization meaning all of these norms. I often think today that gays are the new Jews, where there was a marvelous PBS documentary on the Jews in America, and I encourage people to see this. It's really terrific, and it makes the point that this vision we have of the 1950s America, which comes from films, which comes from the sort of Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, Andy Hardy, let's put on a musical, Babes in Arms, that kind of thing. I mean, that was the product of Metro-Goldwyn mayor and Jewish producers who had this vision of this idyllic, rural, bucolic, wholesome America, and it goes to TV in the 1950s and Leave It to Beaver, and it was the same thing. It's a completely invented vision, and it's a vision invented by an out-group. And I think gays have also had a role in that through their role in the media, through
Fashion,
through Hollywood.
we gentrify
Yes,
neighborhoods,
exactly.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, but there is something, I'm going to be a person sort of, as it were, putting my finger in the dike to say, try to stem the tides of assimilation just a little bit. It is happening. Everything you're talking about is exactly happening, and you raise a good question, Raphael. And probably for our generation of people, there's going to be more and more and more assimilation, except for John Waters, and sad hangers-on like me. But there is a whole younger generation, there are younger generations of gender transgressive queers who fit absolutely no model. I mean, it's all over the place. And it's wonderful. I regard that as incredibly free, incredibly liberating. And some of us are just going to be the old frumps and old farts who are sort of reacting with horror. John Waters will put us in his movies as the people who are trying to stem the tides of change. So I have this little glimmer of hope that just as we think we're kind of sinking into normality, God forbid, which I personally don't want. I regard that as utter hell, just utter hell. But, I do like to barbecue with the neighbors. But I identify more with John Waters and the crew. So there's this other uncontrollable group of genderqueer people and trans and boys and all of these wonderful people coming along who are just going to be in our face, and I love it.
I'm the only one who hasn't said anything, aren't I? I think that what Kay was just saying about sort of gender transgression is, although not necessarily, is, well, sorry, I'm an historian, historically linked with gays and lesbians and, queer people. And part of the point that Lillian Faderman makes in this book that I was citing earlier was not so much that these lesbians' outsider perspective led them to engage in the activism that they engaged in, although I think that there's something that's a very plausible explanation as well. But her point was that, at least in the time period that she was talking about, women who formed partnerships with other women, as opposed to forming partnerships with men, had a tremendous opportunity to opt out of an incredibly oppressive, patriarchal system of gender relations, and that it was precisely the fact that they could, opt out of conventional gender roles that gave them the ability to engage in this work. It may have been their outsider perspective that gave them the desire to engage in this work, or the awareness that the work even needed to be done. But what gave them the ability to do that work was the fact that they were freed from what Faderman and a lot of other people called, the patriarchal mandate to serve men and their progeny, and engage instead in political activism. And I don't think that that would end even with total assimilation.
Do you know I once met Alice Paul? I just have to tell you that.
Did you?
I did in 1971. She was
How
very
cool.
old, but cantankerous as always. It was a thrill.
That would be incredibly thrilling. I love Alice Paul.
And Alice Paul, was the one who was a leader in the suffrage movement?
Yeah, she was the one who led the hunger strikes. She was the one who led the pickets in front of the White House, and they picketed in front of the White House during World War I, and they carried these banners that mocked the president's wartime speeches because he was talking about, "We fight for democracy, for the right of the people to govern themselves," and she would say, "Mr. President, 2 million women are not self-governed. Yeah, it was a little inflammatory. They got jailed.
In the National Women's Party house, she was head of the National Women's Party. And in the files there, you can see the banner that they used to disrupt Woodrow Wilson's inaugural address. It's just right there. And there's also a file that was created at the time. This is like, you know, in the late 1918, 1919, around then, and there's a great big old file that's just labeled shit. It's very, very
I see a
inspiring.
theme tonight with you.
It's that I've been looking at the, well, pink flamingos.
When some of you were speaking, I was thinking of a phrase that I'm going to put Will Roscoe is under the spotlight, so I'm going to kind of put him on the spot and probably butcher something he's said much more eloquently. But in an article, he talks about basically this phrase that sticks in my head, and it's sodomy and gold. And it's about Europeans coming to the New World, what was new to them, and really civilization pivoted on their treatment of indigenous people, which in correspondence back home to Europe, they were just complaining about the sexual and gender diversity of indigenous people. Sodomy was the justification many, many times in taking the gold and taking the treasure. And so I'm kind of torn between, there's this notion that we have this special role in civilization and in the world based on those who have deprived us or hated us. And then on the other hand, because so many queer folks opt out and aren't a part of, not everyone, but many are not a part of the normative kind of reproductive culture, we have some gifts maybe of time and different interests. And are those two things exclusive? I mean, are they, I see them as being different things we provide, or are they somehow
Well, you
linked
know,
in a weird way?
Michael Bronski was invited to London to give a speech to this Harry Potter society in England with the release of the last book. You know, so there are all these Harry Potter scholars and cultural observers and all of this, and his talk was on queering Harry Potter. And he talked about all of the different ways you can read Harry Potter through a queer lens if you understand queer as not just homosexual, but always the perspective of deviating from what is always expected. You know, it being odd and unconventional within the norms of society. And Michael says, and I really love the thought, that one of the things queers and everybody who identifies with queerness in that larger way may think about is never just accepting things on the terms on which they've come, but constantly reinventing the terms on which we understand society, civilization. So you could understand a civilizing influence as opening up an almost limitless array of sexual and gender possibilities. Wouldn't that be interesting?
I kind of like to flip the question around and on a theme I tried to hit a bit, which is the whole idea of, as opposed to opting out, of radically opting in, because the dark side of gay participation in civilization is that we are often part, especially, I mean, mostly men, are often part of this sort of apparatus of repression. I mean, not just of ourselves, but of other people. I mean, you have the institutional Catholic Church, which we can say in its defense that it imposes equally unreasonable standards on heterosexuals. But I think that gay men have always been part of that power structure, and to go even darker. I mean, we all know that early on in the Nazi movement, there was a group of gay men who were
Absolutely.
really into it
Right.
for whatever reason. I mean, there's a book, as far as the Catholic side of it is concerned. There's a marvelous book, and I'm blanking, Mark Jordan, and he teaches at Emory at the Candler School of Theology, and he was the first non-Methodist ever to get the Candler chair. And he's a Roman Catholic, and he writes a book about homosexuality in the Catholic Church called The Silence of Sodom. And he explores this question of exactly why is it that so many gay men are drawn to Roman Catholicism, even when, I mean, especially when it's very, very, very repressive of especially, homosexual desire, although a sexual desire generally. And his answer, the answers he comes up with are not obvious ones. So, another thing for your reading list. But I think it's...
Well, but I think that what your point is good. It's basically, we can't assume that all gay people are equally oppressed, male and
Right.
female. We can't assume that all gay people take that oppression and turn it into truth, beauty, and, help a fellow man. That it oftentimes that oppression, regardless of what context it's in, can actually turn to very malignant in the culture itself, and can transform the civilization towards worse than better. So
I keep thinking about the economic implications. I mean, the phrase that you started off with was about sodomy and gold, and if you think about the tax structure that we have and a lot of the institutional discrimination that exists in society, one of my, I don't know why I do it every year. It's sort of this thing that bothers me. But every time I do my taxes, I go on TurboTax and switch between single and heterosexually married, as defined by our government, to see what the difference would be in terms of the taxes I pay or the taxes I get back. So it's a marriage benefit. That's a nice thing to call it. What it really is a tax on single people, and in particular a tax on people who can never get married because of the way that the society defines marriage as it currently stands. So while we're not all subject to equal amounts of oppression, I think there are certain experiences that we have, unless you completely deny that aspect of yourself and decide to enter into a marriage as it's defined by the state. There is institutional discrimination that does continue to oppress us. And the fact that it's economic and has continued to be economic throughout centuries is fascinating. It shows a really legitimate reason for an entire group of people to be oppressed, to get more money.
Although on the tax issue, I think that's a really interesting example that raises the question of how heterosexism intersects with other kinds of oppression. Because for straight women, or at least women who marry men, there's a different kind of tax implication to marriage, which is that since it is very likely that the female in a female-male couple will be the lower wage earner, she will be counted in tax land as a secondary earner and thus taxed at a higher rate. So for a straight woman, marriage is not a tax benefit, it's a tax liability. I mean, it's, and gosh, I don't know what the implications for that would be with a couple of low-wage earning lesbians getting married. Who would get to be secondary and who would get to be primary? I'm not quite sure how that would be judged. Right, but anyway, so, I mean, yes, absolutely, taxes enforce certain norms, but they don't only enforce heteronormativity, they also enforce the model of a male breadwinner and a female, if not homemaker, at least a female secondary economic party.
They also privilege a certain kind of heteronormative relationship as the only one worth valuing. There is absolutely no reason why we could not adopt a strategy that doesn't force every gay person to get married if they want to have certain legal forms of recognition and certain legal benefits. You could certainly have a situation where you support the right of all people, whatever their sex or gender, who want to marry anybody else, to get married, but not privilege only that relationship in terms of legal rights and recognition. It would be a much more interesting, much more transgressive thing that would actually benefit tons of people on every side of the sexual and gender spectrums. They're not even spectrums, that's so linear. What is it? What is the model of what sex and gender really is if it's not a linear spectrum?
A universe.
Some kind of
A universe.
3D
Throw
thing.
A swarm.
Swarm.
A swarm, that's good.
Fabulous
Will.
morass.
Swarm.
Well, I have dabbled a little in the marriage debate, and I always felt that if there was one thing that we got out of that, it was helping everyone understand their marriages and the ramifications of them, because there's such a wealth of stuff that comes out of that whole debate. I'm sure some of you have been a part of it.
If we are a lot more diverse and a lot more multivalent as people than what the mainstream wants to identify us as, is it not true that the mainstream itself is also equally diverse and contentious?
Yes.
That there is no such thing as a dominant mainstream. Maybe there is a legal, tax categories do exist, but that's also a mythological thing. That they don't own the center of civilization. They don't own society.
They just own the power. Certain people own power mechanisms to enforce certain
Or
ideas,
language.
but that are not true.
That's right.
Right. Good point.
Well, several of us have talked about the acronym LGBT and how it grows, and we sometimes stumble over that. So if there's anything else that we're teaching the world, it's also how to use acronyms.
How to enlarge
Grow
them.
them.
That's really how to grow your acronyms.
Like C
And someday I hope to have a panel discussion on that, because I think language is so, I think it's so awesome. But we will move on from that, actually. And I want to invite anyone else to participate in the discussion and share your thoughts. If you want to ask a panelist about something they've said or anything else, this is the time to do it. We welcome your participation.
Okay.
Okay.
Kay really added a whole dimension by sort of going into reverse gear and saying, well, what about the ways that we counter civilization, which from another certain point of view is this normalizing and repressing quality force wherever it occurs, whether Western or otherwise. But our discussion's been fairly focused on Western tradition here.
Right.
But if you go into any tradition, you can find those who find the normative aspects of civilization to be oppressive, and that there is an underbelly to it that nearly always exists, that just kind of bubbles up from below in a way. So it really made me think that how are these things really actually maybe the same thing? Michelangelo advancing an art form, and John Waters making fun of an art form. That making culture, that innovating is to destroy something that came before.
It's
And that to destroy is to create ground or to create something new at the same time. Now, does that thought trigger you any more?
Well, Raphael was nodding to this, so I'm going to let other people speak. But that's a wonderful statement. There's always this dynamic of destruction and creation that's kind of going on at the same time, and we don't always see it in the moment. And a lot of times you don't see it until just eons after something has been happening. But even the destruction, both the destruction and the creation, it seems to me, are always opening up space in some kind of way, so that other people can begin to recognize themselves and emerge.
I think the problem is, of course, when you get the people doing the destruction as seeing destruction as the only path.
Right.
And the people who think of as building civilization or building norms as the only path. I mean, traditional societies, and to a certain extent our own, you know, we value certain norms, we need them because that's what we think will in fact allow the society to survive. Without these things, without these institutions, without these structures, without being able to pass knowledge in a reasonable way to the next generation, we're afraid that doom is on the other side. And then you get the creative personality that says, no, we have to break these bonds in order for the society to survive. Think out of the box, and then, you know, new possibilities emerge. So I do think those two things go hand in hand simultaneously.
I think there's always a tension, isn't there? It's sort of Hegelian, isn't it? You have the norm building, and then you have the transgression. Yes, exactly, and it keeps on going. I mean, kind of an off-topic comment related to Michelangelo as sort of this builder, this great monument of civilization, or sort of contribution to civilization. Am I the only one here who thinks that Michelangelo was a seriously bad sculptor? I mean, have you ever looked? I mean, look at the David. Look at the David, and you have this puny little 98-pound body, and these enormous hands and this enormous head, and he didn't realize that his block of marble wasn't big enough, so he created this monstrosity. I mean, if a person actually looked like this and walked into the gym, I mean, everyone would just swivel their heads, and not for the reasons you think. And that's just the other example. I mean, you've got the nudes on the tomb of is it Giuliano de Medici's tomb, where it's the
swan neck.
Swan.
Yeah, with the
We'll
falsies.
talk. There are
Yeah,
explanations
okay,
for his bad taste.
Yes.
The David was meant to be seen 60 feet in the air, so that's why the head is so large and the hand is so large, so you can see them.
Oh, I don't buy that. I don't buy that about the sculpture, about the smile. I don't, you know.
You know, here I come in with a tacky observation again, you know, that we're talking about David and Michelangelo, and I always drag us back to John Waters. But, you know, the tension between creation and destruction, you know, in Hairspray, that's a retelling of history. In reality, you know, what he's writing about, the Buddy Dean show, the Baltimore little version of American Bandstand on which Hairspray is based, Negro Day was killed by Buddy Dean. They had it, you know, one day a week or one day a month, but then they killed it. Whereas in the movie, you know, there's a kind of revolution that happens so that everything is integrated, and no integration ever happened. And in Hairspray, you've got this, and I'm talking about the 1988 version. The 2007 version is absolutely terrific, but that's not a John Waters film. That's based on the John Waters film of 1988, which is kind of wonderful. And he's reimagining that whole period, you know, of dance and teen libido kind of bursting out, and forbidden relationships across races and this kind of thing. And it bursts into something that never really happened at the time. But he reimagines it so it becomes a story that we can all take strength from. So that when you're sitting in the 2007 version in Missoula, Montana, and you're watching kids dancing in the aisles, they are so inspired and in love with this movie. That's kind of interesting.
Although I have to say, I really loved Kathleen Turner in
Serial Mom, it's
And
my favorite.
because I identified with her so much.
Say something about
How many of us have
'Cause you
not
love
wanted
children.
to bludgeon someone to death for wearing white shoes after Labor Day? So, I mean, in this town, I love to see anyone wearing white shoes any time of the year.
But you're worried about Michelangelo's depth perception.
Get the sledgehammer.
Any other comments or questions, thoughts, ruminations? How about our panelists? Any final? This was fun. We should do it in the winter sometime when there's a blizzard, and we might. Yeah.
Everyone should wear short shoes.
We'll have more, maybe.
Truly transgressive.
More folks. Well, I hope you feel that civilization is in very good or bad, creative or destructive hands. And I appreciate you all for coming out tonight. We do have tomorrow night a fabulous presentation created just for Out at the Library, created by Montana Rep on Tennessee Williams. It's called The Three Faces of Tennessee. And they're going to use film, they're going to have actors do stage readings, and they're also going to look at some of his notebooks and maybe a short story, and see how queerness moved in and out of Tennessee's work. Specifically looking at Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which the Rep just did and was a lot of fun, and is being done on Broadway now by an all-black cast. So that's tomorrow night, 7 o'clock here in this room. I invite you all to come see that with us, and thank you.
Great. Thank you.